Mary, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on again.
You were on episode 253, and that was in 2019.
Wow.
I'm sure a few things have changed for you. Where are things at today? What are you doing now? What is your current state of affairs?
There have been many changes since we last chatted. I finished my PhD. I accepted a job as an assistant professor of digital audio arts at the University of Lethbridge. And I am coming to you from Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, which is also known as the Windy City. As you know, Chicago has that name as well. So I just hopped Windy Cities.
Wow. So you're in Canada now.
I'm in Canada right now. Yeah. I still have a residence in Chicago. I still go back and forth. But yes, during the school year, I've been in Canada for the last 2 years now.
Let's get into that. Let's just start to dissect that. So how did that job come about? How did that offer come about?
I was finishing up my PhD, as I said, and actually the pandemic kind of worked in my favor for that. It gave me more time to write. So I finished that. And I've been wanting to switch my focus more to teaching. I was teaching as an adjunct for a very long time, and I really wanted to switch to full-time teaching, but still having an audio practice, still having a recording practice myself. So I was looking for positions, and I was aware of the University of Lethbridge through AES because several people have presented from UL and some students have presented from UL. So I was familiar with the university. So I was just looking at job postings for universities that I had an interest in, and Lethbridge had a posting for a lecturer, but it was a focus in popular music, which is not my area. But I figured, what the heck, I'll apply for it. So I did not get that, but 3 months later, they reached out to me and said, there's going to be this other position opened. You should apply for it. And I was thinking, I don't know, do I want to go to a different country? Well, I knew nothing about Lethbridge and Alberta in general, because my only experience with Canada was like Toronto and Montreal and that. So I didn't know the West at all. I was like, oh, that's great. Yeah, I guess I'll apply. I didn't really, at that point, was thinking, no, I don't think I want to go to Canada. So I went through the interview process. It was completely online. And then they offered me the job. And I was like, oh boy, well, I have to see it first. There really wasn't a budget to fly me there for interviews or anything like that. And they're like, well, we don't have that budget. I'm like, that's okay, because if I'm going to move to another country, I need to kind of see it. And it's pretty different from Chicago. It's much smaller. It's 100,000 people. It's not tiny, but much smaller than Chicago. And the other thing that I needed to get used to is Chicago, you drive outside of the city limits, you suburb. Here, not so much. It's like drive 40 minutes and then there's a little town, and drive another 40 minutes. And maybe there's another little town. People keep telling me Calgary's 2 hours away, but I've never been able to do that, even speeding. So about, for me anyway, 2.5 hours away is Calgary, which is, the bigger city. So that was a little getting used to. But, even when I got here to kind of look over the university and meet some people, I was kind of thinking, I don't know. But then I saw their studio, which I'm sitting in right now. This is Studio One. It's a $2 million room. It's gorgeous. I did not expect to find this here. And then I was like, well, I guess I'm going to Canada.
Such a change. So many questions too. A little bit of, I want to get into the minutia of actually that interview process. You applied. Mm-hmm. Did they give you, the first time around, did they give you a rejection letter?
I can't remember.
Okay.
I don't know. I had been interviewing with some universities, and It was maybe about half that actually notified me after, and some didn't bother.
Did they proactively reach out to you and say, we have this other thing, you should apply for it?
They did. They had to go through a proper search, of course, and interview any eligible candidates. But they did encourage me to apply. And also it was a little trickier with me because I'm a US citizen. I'm not a Canadian citizen. So they had to make a case for me to immigration saying that there's no one in Canada with my credentials.
And remind me again, your PhD is in what?
My PhD is in art theory, aesthetics, and philosophy. You'd think it was kind of like in a way different direction, but I kind of made it work because my dissertation was on the aesthetic usage of noise. So I examined how noise was used in creative ways and what it could mean in both art and music. And I have signed a contract with Routledge. The book is currently in the production phase, so that should be coming out soon.
So I should be calling you Dr. Mazurek.
You can if you want. I still have my students call me Mary. I sometimes forget to include the doctor thing when I'm at academic things, but yeah, technically, yes. That's
super impressive. And the pandemic really gave you that little bit of breather room because gigs fell off, right?
Right. I was still working for WFMT. I was really grateful. Still employed full time. My duties had changed. So I was working at home, mostly on my dining room table, producing previous live broadcast I had engineered for rebroadcast. So yes, I was still very much working at the time, but I didn't have a commute and I didn't have to schlep equipment around. There's things I like about doing remote recordings a lot, but what I didn't realize is how much energy, at least I expend when I have to pack up gear, put it in the car, drive to the venue, unload the car, set it up. And most of the time it's just me. Most of the time I don't have an assistant. So I now had all that energy to focus toward finishing my dissertation.
Very different place you're at now. You're in an academic environment. You're also in a very different, geographic setting. You grew up in Chicago, right?
I did, yeah.
What were your observations of how you felt when you arrived and said, okay, I'm doing this. I'm settling down here and I'm taking this gig?
I basically put my dog in whatever gear and some, clothing and a few essentials in my Impreza and drove all the way here. So it's almost 1,800 miles if you stay on the main interstates. Yeah, because it ended up being that it's really expensive to move furniture over the border. It was way cheaper to buy everything new here.
Oh, as opposed to load it in the car or take a moving van?
Yeah. And if I had a moving company, that was even way more money. It was just easier, simpler to buy everything new here. And I said I maintain a residence in Chicago, so all of that stayed there.
Does your place in Chicago sit empty or do you rent it out?
No, it's empty because I own, it's a 2-flat apartment with my 2 brothers, and I spoke to them about that, and they were like, no, because it's kind of our childhood house. So they're like, no, we don't want strangers here. They were like, if you know them really, really well, maybe a short-term thing. But honestly, I go back and forth. So it's nice to have, my place just to go and crash and that.
I always think about this when people are talking about going back and forth between the U.S. and other places. I remember the first time that I went to England and was there for several months making a record. And I came home and I was on Market Street in San Francisco and I could just feel the tension in the air of intensity. I was just like, wow, I think I've had my guard let down while I was in England. And now I'm back and I feel the need to, keep my wits about me.
Well, definitely very different energies between Lethbridge and Chicago. Lethbridge is much slower paced. There's still areas you need to kind of watch yourself if you're around at night by yourself, but mostly safer. I don't know. I've never really had a problem in Chicago, despite how the media projects it sometimes. That's always been fine. The energy in Chicago is much different, much faster paced. And it's different between like the neighborhoods and like, say, downtown. I like both. I'm really enjoying experiencing both.
So let's talk about the classes. So tell me about what you're teaching, what's your schedule essentially like, number of students you're teaching. Talk a little bit in detail about the educational part of your world.
Yeah, sure. The program here is called Digital Audio Arts. There are approximately 80 students in the program. I'm one of the full-time professors here who teaches in that area. I am teaching traditional studio techniques in this particular room. It's a great tracking room. It's a beautiful room. So I like to focus once they get a feel for the board, which is an SSL duality. I like to do a lot of tracking in this room. We do some mixing, but I think this room is really, really, really shines in tracking. Last year, we had a local band come in. Their name is Peace for Bombs, and we tracked 3 songs with them, and we mixed it, and they ended up releasing it as an EP. That was fun. I don't track a lot of rock bands.
Mm-hmm.
That's originally what I wanted to do, though classical has been great, but it was fun. It was a lot of fun to do. There's a student here who composed a musical, and they will be performing it in October. So I think we're tracking that for him.
There's 80 students in the program. Typical class size?
So it depends. If it's more lecture based, it's around 30.
Okay.
If it's, say, more hands-on practical, like the class I just said, I have 16. It's a little large, but we all do fit in the control room. The control room's a little bigger to optimize for class. And then the other class I'm teaching this semester is called Applied Research. I'm actually covering for a colleague who's on study leave for that class. So this is a new one for me. But it's really interesting because I didn't really do any of that work until my master's degree. Basically, they have to come up with original research, and they will present that at a symposium in March called Bounce and Cadence. That's really fun. I think all my students have one really strong topic, so I'm really looking forward the direction they take it in.
You know, I have this image of you because in the past, you posting pictures of you holding DPA mics and classical stuff, and that's my image. Like every time I think of you,
I still do that work. I do a lot of it. Love it. I also teach a course in that, or 2 courses that are kind of focused on more classical music. One of them is we produce EPs. So we have like music students in the class along with engineering students. So I pair them up, and we've made EPs of their stuff. Yep. They're classical musicians in the program studying, music here. And then I take them through the process of making an EP, which I think most engineers, unless you're inside classical, and even most musicians don't really understand the process because it's quite involved, and there's a whole lot of splice and dice and all of that stuff. So just taking them all through the process so they know what to expect when they get out in the real world.
Other than the educational part of it, you continue that work outside of the school?
I do. It's a little tricky for me to do it in Canada because I'm on a work permit for the time being. I have to apply for permanent residency, and then I can freely work in Canada, but I have to be mindful of that. I can do that work within the context of the university, but I can't really run a business here that's still in Chicago. So I still go back during the summer and do that work. So I've just been involved with a lot of live stream concert events in Chicago.
Summer's off.
Yeah, summer I don't teach.
I mean, what a perfect time to go back to Chicago, right?
Exactly.
Winter's in Canada.
Right. I'm kind of doing the snowbird thing backwards.
Because it's not, you're not on the East Coast. You're in Alberta's like what, mountain time?
Yes. Yeah. We're right next to the Rockies. I can see the mountains at the end of my block, which is kind of cool. They're not close, but I can see them.
The winters aren't as intense as Chicago winters, right?
So it's interesting here. We get these things called Chinook winds that come through, and they'll warm the temperature. They'll blow the snow away and it'll warm the temperature. So like I'm part of the tennis club here. So it is possible for me to go play outdoor tennis in January on certain occasions.
Okay.
Yeah, because it'll be 40 or so Fahrenheit and it's dry here. So it doesn't feel quite as cold as like Chicago.
Yeah, very different.
Very different. Oh, except we did have a minus 40 actual temperature day here last year. That was new. I was kind of looking forward to it because at minus 40, that's where Fahrenheit and Celsius cross. So I no longer have to specify which scale I'm using. It was kind of cool because when it hit, I was blowing soap bubbles on my patio and watching them freeze for my amusement.
Well, that raises the question about measurements. When you're measuring mic distances from instruments, do you need to convert?
Yeah, Canada is really interesting because whether Celsius, driving distances in kilometers, but like if you're, as I found out, if you're measuring your apartment for furniture, that's usually inches and feet. So they go back and forth. So generally I just stick with inches. And if somebody's really wants to use centimeters, they can.
Well, so tell me about your work in Chicago in the summer now. How is that structured? And is that done via freelance work?
Yeah, that's all freelance work. Though I'm working for the same organizations I was working with. So I was a full-time employee at WFMT Radio. So now when I go back, I do things for them on a freelance basis. So primarily, I was working on the Ravinia Festival, which is an outdoor venue in Highland Park, Illinois, so close suburb. So I was recording a lot of the classical music there and also did a live broadcast with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra during that time for WFMT. I was working with Classical Music Chicago, who I was working with when I was at WFMT because we did live broadcasts of the Dame Myra Hess concert series. And actually now one of my former students is the engineer for that. So that was kind of fun to see his progression. But I do their other concert series called Rush Hour Concerts, which is from St. James Cathedral, which is on the edge of downtown in Chicago. So there's chamber music and it's live streamed. And then I also post-produce those recordings for later broadcast on WFMT. And then I was working also with Opera Festival of Chicago, so their summer opera company. So I recorded 2 productions, live productions of theirs.
How do you record something like that?
Oh, like opera?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think it's fun. There's a bunch of moving parts. So you have to mic the stage. I've generally got boundary mics on the lip of the stage, and I hang a couple of omnis, a little bit upstage. And then for the pit, because it's a little bit cramped usually, I've done it with 3 omnis in some cases, but sometimes I do a little more spot miking. It depends on a few things and how much time I have. And usually there isn't budget for an assistant, so I'm setting it up myself.
And this isn't tied into front of house at all?
No, No, actually, it's usually not reinforced. I think they did slight enhancement. I can't remember what, like in the one production, they wanted to enhance the chorus a little bit. So there was a separate FOH person just putting a little bit into the system, and we were totally separate. They had their own microphones. I had my own microphones for that.
Audience mics as well?
I did not do audience mics, though I could. So I was basically relying on, I think, the Omnis for the orchestra pit. I think those are picking up the applause pretty well.
I'm getting into the details of this because this is something that I know nothing about. Musically speaking and technologically speaking, I would be like, what? Record an opera? Like what boundary mics? DPAs or buyers or?
Actually, I was using Crown PCCs. I've also used, I've put microphones like either DPAs or Sheps on little desk stands and put them across the stage. Also, when I was at WFMT, we were broadcasting Lyric Opera of Chicago, but this was a long time ago. We had these foam mice that were like flat on the bottom and had a little hole. So you just stick the pencil mic inside and put them on the stage. Those work pretty well. I haven't seen those anymore. And I think the ones FMT had are starting to disintegrate, but those are actually pretty handy at times. Yeah.
And typically in a scenario like that, what would you record to?
If I have room, I would record to Pro Tools and probably a backup of some sort. I have a Joco backup. I also have like the 8-channel Zoom recorder. But honestly, for this production, there's literally no room for barely me. Like I had a chair, that was it, and a shelf or something. I'm like crammed into like one of the lighting lofts or something. So I just used like the Zoom, what is it? I never remember model numbers, the 8-channel.
It's almost like that's a world that could almost merge with the film location sound world. Like I could imagine you with a cart that one would typically see on a location shoot.
Yeah, it could happen. Actually, during the pandemic, I was actually recording operas with a video crew, Haymarket Opera. I think there's still some videos up on clips on YouTube and stuff. Couple we shot at like a TV studio soundstage because we were still really on lockdown and it was hard to get like any kind of venue. So we did 2 operas. They weren't staged, but there was like a projected backdrop and things at a television studio. That was interesting. It's really, really dry, and the orchestra uses reflections to kind of hear themselves. Plus, we had to put all the woodwinds behind plexiglass, and it was a little weird. That the orchestra is really heavily mic'd because, again, we have things semi-isolated, like the winds are semi-isolated and things like that. And I actually mic'd the orchestra from the floor. I put like, I think it was like a coincident pair on a desk stand and like pointed it up at the orchestra and another couple desk stands with omnis because they couldn't be in the shot. Couldn't hang it, anything. So that it couldn't be in the shot. And then the TV studio had some DPA headset microphones. And I'm like, we're not staging this. It's, obviously we're in a TV studio. You want to hear these people and you have like a breakneck schedule. I can't move mic stands on and off. There's no way we're going to make it in time. Put them on wireless DPA headsets. And that's what we used for the singers. And then Illinois started to open up and they were able to get into their venue, which was the DePaul University Opera House or Opera Hall. So we actually had a stage, costumes, and actually DPA was really kind enough to send me their sub miniatures, their little lavalier microphones. So what I did is I dressed the characters with the DPA like under their wigs. and they were on wireless. So I also had the Boundary mics on stage. So I had both to kind of play with in the mix.
When you're running, just quickly back to the opera thing I was asking you about, in those situations, you're not necessarily running just excessively long mic cables. Are you using, or maybe you are you using, or do you ever utilize like Cat 6 cable over like radio catapults or anything like that?
You know what? I haven't. My system's still very like analog that. So no, I am actually running long XLRs.
Okay.
I have snakes and the flown microphones, a couple 100-foot XLRs, and
not to give radio a plug here, but because I have the catapults, it's all analog. It's just 4 channels over Cat 6, but you can run these excessively long Cat 6 cables.
Okay, I'm going to look into that.
Oh, it's really cool. Yeah, I've done it for 2 jazz records where they were remote. So
cool.
So what would one expect to charge for something like recording an opera?
They're usually not for profits. And since I've worked with this company before, they were able to kind of build in my fee into the budget. And then I just charge my normal mixing rates for it afterwards.
Which I guess is a factor we all need to keep in mind is don't trap yourself. Make sure you embed the mixing part too.
Right. So I generally charge them a flat fee to come out and record, like a day rate. So I think it's pretty similar to what, as you said, the location sound people charge. So for a location shoot, and then I charge an hourly fee for mixing.
Do you keep fees segmented into corporate, nonprofit, independent?
That's a good question. I haven't done too much corporate work lately. Because most of what I'm working with are nonprofits or individual musicians who are either funding it themselves or were able to get a grant. So I'm mindful of that. And if it's lower than my typical fee, sometimes I can work with that. I also think about that in some cases, like I'll charge my full fee, but then I'll make a donation back to the organization.
Oh.
So then I get a tax write-off as well.
Well, that's a smart move.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of offset my income and get a little tax write-off there.
Do you tell them that up front? I'm going to charge you my full rate, but I will donate this much back into your organization?
Yeah, sometimes I do. Yeah.
Do you think it's important to tell them that?
I think if there's a concern budgetarily, maybe sometimes I've just donated a little bit back because, they give me regular work.
Yeah.
And I like what they're doing. So.
Okay. Wow. That's a brilliant move. I never would have thought of that. I'm so glad you mentioned it. So when it comes to the equipment, this is a challenging aspect, I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but so I think I've heard you on a couple of occasions say that DPA has been generous to you to lend you stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But have you been in situations where you get a gig and in order to do the gig properly, you think, I'm going to need to buy this piece of gear to do the gig, and you end up buying it and it just ends up sucking up a lot of the profit?
Yeah, actually the gig I got the Grammy nomination on, maybe I broke even on that, but I got a Grammy nomination, so it was totally worth it.
Yeah.
And I'm still using the gear. It's 2017 or 2018 or something we recorded this, and it was a last minute gig. It was for the record company CD, which is a Chicago classical label, and they have an engineer. They have Bill Malone. He's fantastic engineer. He's their house engineer. He does almost everything for them, except he was double booked. And we had John Bruce Ye, who's the clarinetist for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and another orchestra to record, and no engineer. So I happened to be available, and I said, yes, I can do this. And wow, I don't have an interface that can accommodate this. So I bought one. I got one that had been returned at Sweetwater for pretty reasonable cost. So the interface was still a good chunk of money. So yeah, as I said, maybe I broke even with this gig. And then Bill was like, well, I'm recording in the studio that day, so I don't need any of my snakes or stands or anything. So you are welcome to use them. So yeah, I got it. I got it done. And for me, that was an investment. And even though the interface is now considered a legacy piece, it works fine. I still keep using it.
Yeah, and that's the thing about that world is like the microphones, typically one would, at least my association with it is like DPA, Sheps, those higher end microphones. So your investment in that world, if you're going to go into that world, which I assume is a fairly small world, right?
It is fairly small. It is really a specialty kind of recording.
And would you say that it would be frowned upon if you were to be using brands or equipment out of the ordinary that's more, I don't know, studio type stuff or stuff that, oh yeah, I put a 57 on the clarinet. What?
I mean, my go-tos are DPA, Neumann Sheps. I have some other microphones I'll put in there, like AKGs or some other studio mics. I mean, I've used other microphones. I've used SM81s in orchestra. I mean, I'll tend to stick with condensers myself, maybe an occasional ribbon. But yeah, I mean, if I needed coverage, the SM81s are pretty good and not too expensive. And,
I guess where I'm driving at with this is there a snootiness level that comes from some people in the classical recording world?
I'm sure there is. But I don't know. I'm kind of like, okay, whatever works. And I will have to admit, maybe I was a little snooty at the beginning. I'm like, well, you have to do it this way. Oh yeah. And yeah, I get crap on some of the Facebook groups and stuff. Cause I'll do something a little unconventional and I'll get crap for it. And I'm like, I'll be like, did you listen to it?
Right. I was listening to this. I don't know if you know who Gary V is. He's a guy that I follow. He was talking about being, I'm not going to try to recall exactly what he was talking about, but essentially he was talking about being adventurous and being brave and moving forward with whatever you want to do. He said, how many people in the audience have tried, or how many people in the audience hate oysters? And the majority of people held their hands up. And he said, now, out of all of you who raised your hand, how many of you have actually tried oysters? Keep your hands up. And a bunch of people were like, drop their hands. And he said, exactly. You've heard about oysters, but you've never tried them. And I guess that's kind of my issue a lot of times with some of these forums and these interactions online is people just haven't tried stuff.
Yeah, right. Or, they see a picture of it, but they haven't listened to it and they're making a judgment. Yeah, occasionally I'll do stuff that's a little unconventional, or especially for like the live stream stuff where there's cameras. It's kind of nice because they give me carte blanche to do whatever I want. So if I feel like I need to put microphones on a tall stand and cut the image in half, they're like, okay, we'll shoot around it or try to shoot around it. But I know how to shoot video. I know what they ideally want. So I try to come up with miking that minimally disrupts the video if I can. Yeah, because I'll do things like mic from the floor, put things on like little desk stands, like different stereo pairs, and I'll shoot it up from the floor. And I don't get any complaints from the people who are paying me. So that's my priority.
How long were you at WFMT? 29
years.
How did that feel to exit that and to move into this new spot?
It was interesting. I love WFMT. I'm really glad I'm still able to work with them, but I think it was time for a change.
There's probably a lot less running around that you have to do at this gig because class is held in the same spot every time.
Right.
Consistency of people you work with.
Right. It's pretty centralized. I would say the university is pretty great. I'm enjoying it, and I'm still like learning all the possibilities here because this is at the time we're recording this, I'm starting my third year here.
Let's talk about what it feels like to teach somebody who has no background in this, that's learning, that's coming up from the ground up. Like, is there a joy that you get from seeing them excel and grow in front of your eyes?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I always remember that I was one of those people who knew absolutely nothing about audio, or almost nothing about audio when I started. I mean, as you probably know, there was no home stuff. I mean, what do we have then? We had like the Tascam, like 4-track cassette recorder. That was about all you could do at home. There's no Pro Tools. So really the only way you could experience professional recording is to know someone in a recording studio, which, you know, they're not going to let anybody off the street like, hey, I think this is cool, let me see the recording studio. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So for me, my entry into this was through university. I was studying music at DePaul, and they had this degree called sound recording technology. I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. I think I can do that. So that was my entry into it. So I always remember that there was a time I knew pretty much nothing. So I think that's my job here, is to bring students up and make them my peers.
I assume that because they don't know the history of a lot of audio developments over time, and, you know, how challenging it used to be in some respects and how much easier it is now. Do you educate them a bit about the past so they understand where something started and where it's arrived?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I was just showing videos of Les Paul with his sound on sound technique, and what he and Mary Ford had to do an overdub, you know, before there was really any multi-track per se, because he was like cutting to discs and then re-recording with the disc he just cut to do the overdub, which is crazy. Don't have to do that anymore. I'm kind of happy about that. So, but I mean, I remember like spot erasing analog tape, and oh my God, I'm so glad I don't have to do that anymore. Like, oops, just because if you make a mistake, it's gone.
So do you teach the student from the full-on perspective of digital recording without reference to the old analog ways, or do you incorporate that and say, here's how we used to do it, here's how we do it now?
I try to give them some background, especially like in the beginning of the semester. But I feel like Canadian semesters are on the short side. So I feel like we have to like really pick up the pace toward the end, because I also want to make sure they understand this system, and like also how to manage like recording sessions and musicians and all of those components. Because you know what, this was a discussion at another professional society. Like, well, can you do audio recording and learn it all at home? And I'm like, of course you can. You can now. It's way easy to do that. However, I feel like a university education or like a more formal education, like I can show you signal flows and workflows and all of that more efficiently than one trying to figure it out at home. And also I can give you the perspective, okay, this is what a U47 sounds like. This is what a 57 sounds like, and what the contexts are for these microphones. Because I don't think the person who tries to do it themselves at home is ever going to have the experience of using some of these higher end mics like a U47. And yet I can go walk in the other room and pull that out of the mic closet and compare that with a whole array of microphones. You know, so I can give like a student that perspective, and I can also give them perspective into if they want to collaborate with others, like what those expectations are.
I think if I were teaching nowadays, I think I would try to have students record like once a week at minimum. Like bring in a full group and say, okay, let's do this. And just repeat that weekly, interspersed with, a little bit of lecturing. In your world, is there an expectation of, we need you to do things this way? Like, is there an expectation of how to teach versus you deciding that you're going to implement a particular curriculum?
Well, I think that depends on the institution. I've taught at institutions where they hand you the syllabus and they hand you all the materials and say they need to do all of these things. You can teach it any way you want to, but they have to hit these markers specifically. And I have been to other institutions where they're like, the topic is this. There you go. I would say here at University of Lethbridge, it's somewhere in the middle of that. There's only one traditional studio techniques course taught per semester, and I'm the only one who teaches it. So I don't have to match the curriculum with other professors who might be teaching it. So when I got here, I asked, is there a past syllabus I could look at? Is there someone I could talk to who's taught it before, or any of that? So I got a little bit of that information, but I also was like, okay, how do we make the best use of this space? And as I said, it's an amazing tracking space. Certainly you can mix here, of course. But I think you could also mix in the box if you wanted to and do a pretty good job of that. So I personally feel like this is a great tracking room. So I focus on that. We do some mixing, we do some mastering, but yeah, the focus in this particular class, in this particular room, I feel like to optimize the space is more tracking. But that's me.
We're about out of time. For the audience, I'll include Mary's website in the show notes, marymazurek.com. I'm so excited for you. I know I'm a little late to the congratulations party here, but
no problem.
I think that's fantastic what you're doing in this change. Amazing difference. I talked to a lot of people who've come back to the show and there's changes, but for many people, the changes are minimal. This is pretty major.
Yep. Bit of a jump. Yeah.
Thanks again, Mary. It's great to see you. Great to catch up. And I'm just blown away at what you're doing. That's fantastic.
Oh, thank you. And thanks so much for having me on again. It's great to chat.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you take care.
Thank you.